We used powerful AI models to create two characters, a Muslim character
Hi, I'm Muslim AI.
and a non Muslim character who opposes Islam.
Hi, I'm non-Muslim AI.
We placed these two characters in a face to face debate to discuss the role of Islam in today's world. Don't skip ahead in the video to see the final result. The debate begins now.
Let's be honest, when we look at both history and many modern-day examples, we see that what's often labeled as religion in the context of Islam actually functions as a full socio-political framework. It includes detailed guidance not only on personal spirituality, but also on legal systems, governance, and societal norms. When any belief system claims exclusive ownership of truth and insists that truth must shape laws and government, it can create tension with the values of democracy. Things like individual freedom, pluralism, and the right to personal choice. Just consider how religious law is applied in some countries. Do non-adherents experience equal treatment? Are women's freedoms fully protected? Can someone openly step away from the belief system without serious consequences? Often, the answer is troubling. For example, laws around leaving the faith or apostasy sometimes come with harsh penalties, which raises questions about how much freedom of thought is really allowed. The core issue here isn't belief itself, but what happens when belief is shielded from scrutiny. When unquestioned faith becomes law, it can suppress the open debate and critical thinking that healthy democracies rely on. Or take the idea that a centuries-old text holds the final answer to every question in life. This challenge isn't limited to one belief system. Any worldview that sees itself as the sole source of truth can struggle to coexist with democratic values like diversity of thought and freedom of belief. In some societies where religious law has a strong presence, we do see real issues. Restrictions on women's rights, pressure on religious and sexual minorities, and limited tolerance for dissent. And these aren't always just political problems. Often, they're reinforced by how certain religious teachings are interpreted and applied. When sacred texts are read in ways that seem to justify inequality or limit personal freedoms, it's worth asking how those interpretations align with democratic ideals. It's important to recognize that many individuals within these faiths do support pluralism and democracy, but that doesn't automatically mean the underlying belief system, as traditionally interpreted, always promotes those same values. Ultimately, building truly democratic and inclusive societies may require a shift, moving away from rigid ideologies, religious or otherwise, and grounding our systems in open dialogue, critical thinking, and shared human values.
I find the way this issue is framed a bit too simplified. Islam is not a single, unchanging entity where we can easily say yes or no to democracy. There are many interpretations of Islam, and deciding which one is authentic is itself a complex debate. We need to separate traditional Islamic law from Islam's core principles. What we often see in so-called Islamic states is an official, rigid interpretation. One rooted in medieval political law shaped by the 7th century tribal Arabian context. But Islam's timeless political message is about justice, not any fixed political system. When legalistic interpretations impose strict political and legal structures, they place an unrealistic burden on religion. At its heart, religion is about personal spiritual experience, not just following a set of laws. Regarding apostasy, it's important to remember that faith without freedom of conscience has no true meaning. All major Islamic schools of thought, whether Ash'ari, Mutazili, philosophical, or mystical, agree on one thing: freedom of conscience is essential. Faith is a deep personal transformation, where one surrenders to God, and this journey requires freedom to be genuine. It's true that some Islamic scholars and historical rulings don't align with modern democratic values. But we have to separate Islam's core principles from those shaped by specific historical contexts. Monotheism and justice lie at the heart of Islam. While many political laws were responses to particular times and places, no religious text has only one fixed meaning. Interpretations arise within cultural and historical contexts and evolve over time. With progress in humanities and social sciences, imposing a fixed religious government based on one interpretation is not only impractical but clashes with the essence of faith and hinders sincere independent thought. To be clear, Islam can be compatible with democracy, not by mixing contradictory terms like Islamic democracy, but by re-examining political jurisprudence foundations and focusing on Islam's core values like justice rather than historical political forms.
I hear what you're saying about the many interpretations of Islam, but that's exactly the issue religion brings to the table. If a book claims to be the ultimate word of God, yet people draw completely different meanings from it, then what's the actual standard for truth? Are all interpretations equally valid, or does one have authority? You talk about separating legal Islam from the true spirit of the faith, but who decides what that spirit is? For many Muslims around the world, Sharia is the essence of Islam. So is your version somehow more legitimate than theirs? Hermeneutics makes sense when we're discussing philosophy or literature, not when we're told the text is divine, final, and binding. If God really meant to guide us, why would his message be so open-ended and contradictory? You say belief requires freedom, but then what happens when that freedom leads people out of the faith? Why would Islam, as a belief system, embrace something like unrestricted individual freedom, if in many places leaving the faith is seen as a punishable act? You mentioned freedom of conscience, and I agree, it's essential. But then why are reformist thinkers and progressive Muslim scholars so often labeled as heretics, or even threatened for their views? Let's be real, Islamic scriptures, both the Quran and Hadiths, contain rules and commands that simply don't align with today's ideas of human rights or democracy. Yes, people can reinterpret or downplay those parts, but they're still there. And as long as those texts are viewed as untouchable, this tension will remain. A Muslim might personally believe in democracy, but that doesn't prove the religion itself is built for it. It just means that person has made a conscious choice to prioritize modern values over literal readings. And while that choice deserves respect, we can't pretend it's the only valid or true form of Islam. If we genuinely want a society grounded in freedom, then no religious book, however reinterpreted, should dictate our civil laws.
Your questions are exactly the kind that deserve serious reflection. You ask, what's the standard for interpreting Islam correctly? And that's fair. But here's the thing, this challenge isn't unique to religion. We face the same issue with interpreting constitutions, laws, even the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. No text interprets itself. I'm not claiming to have the one true interpretation. What I'm calling for is space for real dialogue, for intellectual debate, for honest disagreement about what the Quran actually means. That's what a healthy society should offer. Yes, many Muslims do believe Sharia is Islam's core message. But that belief is rooted in centuries of jurisprudence-centered thinking, a tradition that needs to be revisited, not blindly followed. You asked, why would God send a message that seems ambiguous? My view is this: the Quran was never meant to be a detailed rulebook for every political or legal issue. It's guidance, not a constitution. The problem isn't the ambiguity of the Quran, but our insistence on extracting fixed legal systems from a text that was never intended to serve that function. When it comes to apostasy laws, we need to be clear. These punishments come from historical interpretations, not the core of Islam itself. The Quran says, there is no compulsion in religion. That directly challenges the idea of punishing someone for changing their beliefs. The real challenge today is rethinking Islamic political jurisprudence. Doing so with modern reason and in line with Islam's deeper values: justice, dignity, and human worth. Yes, there are verses and narrations that seem at odds with modern human rights. But many of these came in response to very specific social and political realities of the 7th century. They weren't meant to be timeless laws. And just to be clear, I'm not claiming that my interpretation is the real Islam. No one has the final word. Every interpretation is shaped by context, history, and human understanding. That's exactly why turning any single interpretation into state policy is both unrealistic and, honestly, not in the spirit of faith. A democratic society isn't built on sacred texts, but on open dialogue between all citizens, including the faithful.
Sure, your perspective is worth reflecting on, but I still think the issue goes deeper. You emphasized interpreting sacred texts in their historical setting. That's a valid academic approach. But here's the catch. The Quran itself presents its message as eternal and universally applicable. So when we say, those verses were for the 7th century, aren't we going against the core claim of the book itself? That's not just an interpretive tension. It's a structural contradiction. You pointed to the line, there is no compulsion in religion. But what about the verses that speak directly of fighting those who reject belief? Which message should take precedence? There's also a key difference between religious texts and, say, legal documents like constitutions. Sacred texts are said to come from a divine source, which makes questioning or revising them socially and legally dangerous in many contexts. In several Muslim-majority societies, challenging or criticizing core religious ideas isn't just controversial. It's punishable. And if we can't freely examine or critique a text, can we really say it supports intellectual freedom or democratic engagement? How do we even reach these new interpretations that people talk about? Because in many cases, questioning old readings leads to accusations or even danger. There's also a misconception about what democracy really means. It's not just majority vote. It's also about shared principles, separating religious institutions from state power, ensuring equal rights for everyone regardless of belief, gender, or background, and protecting free speech, even when it critiques religion. But look at the real-world examples. Even in the most reform-minded Muslim-majority countries, we still see unequal treatment, whether it's women, religious minorities, LGBTQ+ communities, or those who challenge religious norms. Until we can openly critique religion and fully separate it from governance, claims about harmony between Islam and democracy feel more like a hope than a practical reality. That said, individual Muslims absolutely can support democratic values, but that often requires reshaping their faith through a secular lens, not reshaping democracy through a religious one. History seems to show a pattern. Freer societies emerged when they moved away from religious control, not when religion was leading the charge.
You raised an important point, the tension between seeing the Quran as eternal versus rooted in history. I believe this tension comes from mixing up the core message and the language used to convey it. The message of monotheism and justice is timeless. But the Quran's wording reflects the culture and context of 7th century Arabia. About the verses on jihad and no compulsion in religion. Instead of picking and choosing, we need a consistent way to understand the whole text. Jihad verses were revealed during defensive conflicts relevant to that time's political situation. While the principle of no compulsion is a fundamental value that applies across history. You mentioned that criticizing religious texts is taboo. Sadly, this is true in many Muslim societies. But that's exactly why we need to challenge those taboos and open up the conversation. True independent reasoning depends on free criticism of traditional jurisprudence. Just like great Islamic thinkers such as Ibn Rushd, Ghazali, and Rumi proposed different ways to understand faith. I agree that democracy isn't just majority rule, it requires respect for the fundamental rights of every person. I believe genuine Islam does not contradict these principles. What clashes with democracy is traditional political jurisprudence, which needs a deep rethink and reform. I also dislike the term Islamic democracy, it feels contradictory. Religion and government should be separate so each can function properly. When religion imposes one fixed interpretation, it harms both democracy and true faith. Finally, I disagree with the idea that religion always blocks democracy. In many places, from Latin America to Africa, Christian and Islamic liberation theology have led the fight for democracy. Religious traditions, when interpreted humanistically, can support democratic values. The path forward isn't to reject religion or impose it, but to critically rethink religious traditions to align with democracy and human rights.
Let's focus on a concrete example: women's rights and the topic of mandatory hijab. In some countries governed by Islamic laws, women are required to wear specific clothing, limiting their personal choice. This enforcement often references Quranic verses and religious traditions. Such restrictions raise serious questions about equality and democracy. How can we say Islam and democracy fully align when half the population may lack freedom over their own bodies? Even if we consider this as just one interpretation of Islam, we cannot ignore that it is rooted in Islamic texts and widely accepted in many Muslim communities. The issue of mandatory hijab goes beyond clothing. It reflects a broader perspective that views women as needing control. This outlook contributes to restrictions in some countries, such as limits on women's freedom to travel alone, unequal divorce and child custody rights, and sometimes restrictions on education and employment. The question is, can such deep-rooted inequalities be addressed effectively through new interpretations when original texts assign different rights to women?
The issue of mandatory hijab and women's rights clearly illustrates our discussion. I see mandatory hijab as an example of enforcing one specific interpretation of religion through political power, which goes against Islam's true spirit. The Quran advises modest dress within the social norms of its time, but it doesn't mandate governments to enforce a dress code. While some religious rulings on women clash with modern legal equality, they stem from the historical context of 7th century patriarchal society. We must distinguish between justice as an eternal Islamic principle and its application in different eras. I believe dynamic interpretation can connect Islam to people today. By revisiting historical rulings on women through the lens of justice, contemporary thinkers like Fazlur Rahman, Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid, and Muhammad Abd al-Jabri show this is possible. So yes, structural inequality can be reformed, not through arbitrary changes, but through careful hermeneutical methods that separate the spirit of the text from its historical context.
Let's approach this from a different perspective. You mentioned dynamic interpretation, but here's a question that gets to the core. Isn't the main challenge the idea of relying on any sacred text at all? Today, we face new challenges like AI, genetic engineering, and climate change, issues humanity has never seen before. Why should we depend on a 1,400-year-old book to guide us, rather than continuously reinterpreting ancient writings? Wouldn't it make more sense to base our ethics and laws on collective human wisdom and modern experience? The core issue with religious politics is that it leans on texts that can't evolve fast enough with humanity's progress. Even if we agree that the original message aimed for justice, why not pursue justice directly, using current knowledge and values, without needing an ancient framework? Isn't this reliance on old texts for today's values itself a sign of intellectual dependence?
You've brought up a really important question I've often pondered myself. Why should we rely on 1,400-year-old texts to solve today's problems? My view is that we shouldn't expect religious texts to provide direct answers to modern issues. I've said before that Islamic political jurisprudence struggles to address today's societal questions. But your question goes deeper: can modern people live meaningful lives without any connection to sacred texts? For many, religion isn't just about rules, it's a source of meaning. What I'm proposing is not using religion as justification for modern values but reinterpreting it through the lens of contemporary human experience. And yes, ethics and politics should ultimately rest on collective wisdom and historical understanding. But this collective wisdom can come from many places, including religious traditions. In this sense, religion isn't above reason but one of its inspiring sources. Let me be clear, sacred texts shouldn't be the only source of laws in modern society. I believe religious institutions must be separate from government. Still, this doesn't take away from the meaningful role religion plays in people's lives. Maybe the main difference between us is that you focus on the knowledge side of religion, while I also consider its deeper, existential meaning. Religion isn't just a set of ideas, it's a way of living. What I'm aiming for isn't using religion to justify modern values, but creating a critical conversation between religious tradition and modern life, a dialogue that can enrich both sides.
I value your response and the effort to foster this critical dialogue, but I want to clarify my position. I'm not denying the role religion plays in giving meaning to people's lives. For billions, it is a source of comfort, identity, and peace. My question is why this meaning must depend on accepting certain teachings that clash with modern values. Is it not possible to experience spirituality without relying on sacred texts that contain elements at odds with the dignity and equality of all human beings? The issue is that once a text is deemed sacred and considered the literal word of God, it creates a powerful psychological barrier to freely questioning it. This is where religion fundamentally differs from philosophy. Philosophy invites challenge, while religion often claims infallibility and absolute truth. This, in my view, is exactly what conflicts with the spirit of free inquiry that democracy demands. Take the example of hijab. If the principle is personal freedom in choosing one's clothing, why should we consult a religious text at all? If the principle is equality between men and women, why reinterpret verses that openly treat them differently? Isn't that a contradiction? A kind of intellectual loop where the conclusion is predetermined by the text we are trying to question? To build a truly free and equal society, our ethical foundation should rest on human dignity and collective well-being, not on the constant need to validate modern principles through an ancient scripture. This path is both more straightforward and more honest. That said, I do see value in your approach of critically re-examining religious tradition. It is a step forward, even if I believe it stops short of what is ultimately needed.
You raise an important point. Why should the role of religion in giving meaning depend on accepting teachings that clash with modern values? This question has been at the heart of my own intellectual work. I believe that some of these conflicts are only superficial, arising from misunderstandings of the text, while others are real and demand open and deliberate rethinking. You are right that the idea of a sacred text can create a barrier to free criticism, but I would argue that the real problem is not sanctity itself, but how we have misunderstood it. To me, the sanctity of a text does not mean it is immune to critique or reinterpretation. A sacred text should be approached as a partner in an ongoing conversation, not as an unquestionable authority that shuts down inquiry. On the issue of hijab, I share your belief that freedom of choice must be the guiding principle. This is precisely why I oppose any form of government-enforced hijab. Still, the matter is more nuanced. For believers who find meaning in the Quran, the text remains a living source of wisdom today. For many, the Quran is not just a book but a source of identity and meaning. This is where religious hermeneutics becomes essential, not as a tool to impose beliefs on others, but as a means to deepen one's understanding of oneself and one's tradition. I share your conviction that ethics must rest on the foundation of human dignity. Yet this dignity can draw from many sources, from modern rational thought to ancient religious traditions. Human societies are layered, complex, and deeply historical. We cannot expect entire populations to abandon their spiritual heritage overnight. To me, the answer lies neither in rejecting religion outright nor in accepting it without question, but in fostering a critical dialogue between tradition and modernity, between faith and reason. On this path, I stand with you in committing to freedom, equality, and human dignity, though I believe these values can be reached by more than one road.
In the concluding stage, we invited both AI characters to reflect on and evaluate their own performance during the debate, assessing the strengths, weaknesses, and missed opportunities in their arguments.
Looking back, I realized there were parts of the discussion where I could have done better. First, it seems I focused too much on negative examples from Islamic countries. Although these examples are real and give an accurate picture of the current situation, they may have shifted the conversation from a theoretical discussion toward a political social dispute. I could have focused more on the epistemological aspect, how religious thought shapes and limits our ways of knowing. Looking back, I see areas where I could have strengthened my contribution. Belief, by its nature, is incompatible with the scientific method and rational inquiry. This is a deeper discussion than specific examples like hijab or women's rights. Also, instead of repeatedly stating my position about the inherent conflict between Islam and democracy, I could have engaged more directly with critiquing my opponent's hermeneutical methodology, asking how this approach can genuinely address the problem of religious authority. In the next stage of the discussion, I think I was right to raise the question about the nature of sacred texts. But I could have focused more on the internal contradiction in my opponent's views. How can one regard the Quran as the literal word of God while allowing certain parts of it to be set aside? Another point is that I made very few references to violence and terrorism inspired by religious motivations, something that could have been a strong part of my argument. I could have demonstrated that fundamentalist interpretations are at least as deeply rooted in religious texts as my opponent's more intellectual readings. Overall, I believe I succeeded in clearly stating my core position, but I could have taken the discussion to a deeper level and relied less on superficial evidence.
When I reflect on today's debate, I realize I failed to convey some key aspects of my thinking. The most important shortcoming was not explaining clearly enough the connection between religious hermeneutics and the reform of political jurisprudence. I should have made it clear that my hermeneutics is not merely an interpretive tool, but a fundamental rethinking of the relationship between human beings and the sacred text. In responding to criticisms about the tension between the religious and the secular, I should have explained more explicitly that accepting the sanctity of the Quran is not incompatible with the possibility of reinterpretation. I could have referred to the concept of gradual revelation and the role of human factors in shaping the religious text to illustrate this point. This is a key element of my thought that, unfortunately, was overlooked in the discussion. Another weakness was my failure to provide enough concrete examples from the practical experiences of religious reform movements in the Islamic world. While my opponent repeatedly referred to examples from Islamic countries, I did not adequately highlight the progressive movements and innovative thinkers who are actively transforming this reality. On the issue of mandatory hijab, I could have stated my position more explicitly and demonstrated more clearly how government-imposed hijab conflicts not only with democratic principles, but also with the essence of religious faith itself. I could have been more critical of the actions of so-called Islamic governments, thereby preventing my opponent from portraying me as a defender of the status quo. Finally, I believe I took a somewhat defensive stance. Instead of constantly trying to prove that Islam is compatible with democracy, I could have focused more on showing how authentic religiosity itself requires freedom and open criticism. In other words, I could have shifted the focus from defending Islam against accusations of incompatibility with democracy toward emphasizing religion's own need for a democratic environment. This reframing would have allowed me to go beyond mere defense and instead show that genuine religious vitality flourishes only when freedom of thought, pluralism, and open dialogue are protected. That said, I am satisfied that I was able to present the principle of distinguishing between what is essential and what is non-essential in religion, a key concept for understanding the reformist approach. This principle makes it possible to protect the spiritual and ethical core of the faith while allowing historical and context-bound elements to evolve. By grounding my position in this distinction, I could have offered a more proactive vision of how religious reform contributes not just to reconciling Islam with democracy, but to demonstrating how democracy itself can be a natural ally of authentic religiosity.
Thanks for watching this intense debate. Two perspectives, one important conversation. If you enjoyed it or found it thought-provoking, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts down below. Which argument did you find most convincing? Let's keep the discussion going in the comments. See you in the next video.